has been a sad and frustrating few weeks if you are a person who watches the news. Of course, I'm talking about Afghanistan. People are dying, shot in the streets by the Taliban as they reclaim control of the country. They are falling from planes right out of the landing gear. And then there's, of course, the U.S. soldiers, at least 13 of which were killed alongside civilians in suicide bombings launched by ISIS-K near the airport in Kabul. Here in the United States, we're just screaming at each other about who messed this up and who botched our previously successful occupation of Afghanistan. It is enough to make you want to scream. 9/11 is coming up, the 20th anniversary of the terrorist attacks that set us off on this mission of reworking the Middle East in our image and fighting a war on terror anywhere it can be found. It is remarkable to me how the war on terror and our post-9/11 missions have done exactly the opposite from liberating us from fear. We wallow in terror now more than ever. Anxiety run amok, fear of death, delusion about our ability to control any of those things. I'm a Star Wars podcaster, and if you're watching this, you probably know or should know that Star Wars formed in part how I see the world. I didn't know this at the time we undertook the War on Terror because I was about 11 years old, but Star Wars knew exactly how this would end. Star Wars knew that this would end badly. Not just George Lucas's prequel trilogy, but the original trilogy as well. Their story is about the fight of heroic people against their fear, making trade-offs over control, learning to let go, and when they failed to do that, seeing firsthand the kind of damage they cause by trying to bottle up the chaos of the galaxy to make themselves feel better. Fans of Star Wars talk a lot about the prequel's political message. Lucas has long boasted that he knew the backstory of Darth Vader and thus the fall of the Republic from the earliest years of writing the original Star Wars. He always had a political vision with those original Star Wars films. He expressed his misgivings about the Vietnam War era and vaguely hinted toward the Nixon administration, American imperialism, and more. So the prequels were always bound to follow suit in channeling Lucas's pretty distinct old-school liberal politics. But what has always struck me about episodes 1 through 3 is how these movies that were supposedly outlined well before the turn of the century ended up meshing so perfectly with what was unfolding in the news at that time. A threat to a republic from a frightening new enemy, a Congress all too eager to give its head of state a suite of robust emergency powers to meet that threat, and a war predicated on a lie. Star Wars understood about this situation before the rest of us watched it play out on theater screens and on CNN was that the pursuit of total control by regimes past and present almost never plays out in favor of democratic ideals. Fear, power, self-righteousness, and even good intentions can corrupt and misguide the best of us. And when they do, you lose something along the way that you more often than not can't get back. Maybe it's your liberties, your privacy, a loved one, or in the case of Luke Skywalker, a hand. Think about Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, since I mentioned Luke, and Yoda's warning to Luke when he experienced a vision of Han and Leia suffering in Cloud City at the hands of Darth Vader. Luke cuts short his training on Dagobah, and he mounts his X-Wing to fly to his friend's rescue. Yoda and Obi-Wan are both emphatic that Luke is making a mistake. The same mistake made by his father when Anakin was plagued by similar visions of Padme's death. Yoda tries to stop him. He says,
"If you choose the quick and easy path, as Vader did, you will become an agent of evil."
But Luke is convinced Han and Leia will die if he doesn't intervene. I think we can now safely say, at this point, Luke was wrong. In the end, Leia escapes with the help of Lando Calrissian, and Han is sealed in carbonite and transported to Jabba by Boba Fett. These things are already in motion when Luke arrives for his fight against Darth Vader in Cloud City. Luke ultimately goes home short with one hand, and in need of a new lightsaber, and carrying the burden of knowing Darth Vader to be his dad at a time where it probably wasn't good for him to know this. This is a sucky moment for Luke on the hero's journey, one that could have been avoided if he hadn't let his actions be governed by fear and contempt for things being uncertain. This is how the dark side works its will in Star Wars and in our lives. And it's what George Lucas had challenged fans to reflect on since Star Wars first began in '77 and continued on with into the Bush years, and our war on terror. You don't wind up with widely used expressions like, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, without there being some historical merit in the saying. To the best of our knowledge, this comes from Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil wrote, and I'm going to botch the Latin here, but facilis descensus averno. The descent to hell is easy. You're likely familiar with this idea and you've heard it before, and that's because Star Wars is one of our time's most effective funnels for philosophy and spiritualism just like this. Characters like Yoda, they hold inside them all of the greats. Buddha, Confucius, Christ, just to name a few. And as such, Star Wars aligns really nicely with those words from Virgil. But Stephen, what does this have to do with the war on terror and 9/11, which is presumably why you're ranting about all of this? Well, a lot actually. Remember when Luke asks Yoda on Dagobah if the dark side is more powerful? Yoda replies to him,
No. Quicker, easier, more seductive.
This is something most people understand to be true, and they live it out in their own lives. The American founders definitely did. That's why it's baked into American government that so much of governing is somewhat slow, arduous, and requires frustrating levels of consensus. As politics becomes more mired in gridlock, indecision, and contempt for one another, you start to hear a lot of, we must do something, proposed in opposition to process, normalcy, or just cool-headedness. But let's be real. Being cool as a cucumber about disorder is not politically popular. Taking action, or doing something, anything sometimes, that is popular, right? Remember, quick and easy path. Action is the lifeblood of politicians, and it comes from fearful voters, like us. It's the language of the loving parent who watches on TV as news of a school shooting is unfolding just a few hours away. There will never, ever be a day when I drop my own daughter off at school without experiencing flashes of pain and anxiety that look a lot like NBC News headlines saying, yet another school shooting. Now, if you or I were to sit down in front of Master Yoda at the Jedi Temple on Coruscant and ask, Master Yoda, I'm plagued by visions of pain, suffering, and death regarding my children. I'm afraid of harm that could befall them at school. What must I do? There's a really good chance that Yoda might respond similarly to the way he does regarding Anakin Skywalker's visions of personal loss.
The fear of loss is a path to the dark side. Death is a natural part of life. Rejoice for those around you who transform into the Force. Mourn them, do not. Miss them, do not. Attachment leads to jealousy. The shadow of greed, that is.
A while back, I was listening to the Art of Happiness podcast by Arthur Brooks. He's a conservative author and public speaker, and Brooks speaks a lot about his general appreciation for Buddhism and his meetings with Tibetan monks, including the Dalai Lama. On his podcast, Brooks described asking one of the monks how to better understand bad feelings such as anger, fear, or disgust. And he recalls the response from the Dalai Lama being, you see them as a signal that you have an attachment that you need to address. So remember what I said about Yoda being a funnel for real-world philosophy and spiritualism here. Because I am imperfect, just like all of you, I for one would be agitated, maybe even furious at either of the responses from the Dalai Lama or from Yoda. And Anakin was not too pleased either. Like, you mean to tell me that my problem is not the mortal danger looming over my loved ones, but that I am too attached to them? That's bogus. Most people won't accept this. No half-decent parent, sibling, spouse, or friend can think this way reasonably. Sure, Anakin wasn't supposed to have a spouse for exactly this reason while living his life as a Jedi, but, you and I have not signed up to be Jedi. Probably your neighbors haven't either. So what are we supposed to do?
Train yourself to let go of everything you fear to lose.
Should we embrace this kind of dispassionate, aloof Zen as parents or as husbands and wives or as citizens? No, probably not. We aren't a society of monks, and we need to be caring for, loving each other and all of the people around us, but perhaps we should be willing to hold the reins more loosely. Battles with fear, like that of the war on terror, may well be out of our hands at this point. Like, there's a saying that goes something like, what freedoms you give up to the government, you won't likely get back. And in this case, that rings really true to me. The tentacles of the war on terror have already crept into our daily lives in the form of security cameras on every corner, getting manhandled at the airport by the TSA, a militarized police force, and an FBI who treats domestic political extremism the same as it might foreign terrorism. Did you see after the January 6th tragedy, the op-eds calling for a war on terror approach to be turned inward toward domestic political extremism? What I would say to all of you out there, no matter what your politics are, could be painfully centrist politics, MAGA, socialist, anarcho-libertarian, whatever. You're kidding yourself if you think the deep state types and CIA swamp monsters of the world will only be coming after people you dislike. A war on terror approach to extremism literally translates to signing off on disappearing people in the middle of the night, throwing them in Gitmo to await trial for maybe years at a time. That's signing off on all your emails, phone calls, and texts being exchanged between your provider and the FBI at their request. That might look like Apple agreeing to not encrypt their devices so that government can get into your stuff, supposedly only when a crime has been committed, but you should all know that they don't need a crime, just a suspicion of one that maybe one could happen. This is what Star Wars, particularly the prequels, is all about. You create clone troopers to meet a threat. You violate ethics and all sorts of standards around the sanctity of life and of civil liberties to face that threat. But eventually it becomes clear that the threat is everywhere. Maybe even your own people are the threat. So you turn the clones inward. You clean house. You assign blockchain codes to all of your citizens and their ships and their guns, if you even allow them to have guns. Because it was never about a particular enemy. It was about threats in general. It was about our uncertainty, our fear, and our desire to control our fate. But I want to give fear and uncertainty its due. There's a reason that we indulge it. It's because it's helped mankind survive as long as it has, certain levels of caution. But that is going to be for another video. Until then, I'm Stephen Kent. May the Force be with you, always. Hi, I'm Stephen Kent. Thanks for checking out my channel. If you liked this video, please hit that like button, leave a comment. I always try to respond to every single one. And subscribe! Hit that button down below so you're getting a notification every time a new video posts. We would love to have you be part of the community, and I look forward to talking to you. If you like Star Wars and you're interested in politics, which I suppose is why you're on this channel in the first place, you should also consider checking out my new book. It's called How the Force Can Fix the World, Lessons on Life, Liberty, and Happiness from a Galaxy Far, Far Away. And it is my love letter to Star Wars and my stating of the belief that these movies, these stories, these books, comics, the characters, they offer us guidance on how we can live better lives, be better people, and possibly, by extension, make our politics a little less crazy, possibly even better. I hope you'll like it. I've put so much love into this book. It comes out on October 26th, 2021 of this year, and it's up right now for pre-order. So hit that subscribe button on your way out. I'm Stephen Kent. May the Force be with you. Always.